to today's Consciousness Club. If you can just make sure you're on mute after you've joined the meeting, just so we don't get any interference. Do feel free to leave your cameras on if you wish. And just a note that the main presentation will be recorded as usual. We'll then stop the recording and move into the Q&A phase. Okay, so it's a real pleasure today to be hosting Keith Franksih for today's Consciousness Club. So Keith is an honorary professor in the philosophy department at the University of Sheffield. He's a visiting research fellow with the Open University and an adjunct professor with the Brain and Mind programme at the University of Crete, where he's based. He's also editor of the Cambridge University Press series Elements in Philosophy of Mind. Keith's work is primarily in philosophy of mind, although also in other areas of philosophy. In the past, he spent many years thinking about the nature of belief and reasoning, and developed a new two-level view of the mind, which was articulated in a 2004 book, Mind and Supermind. And more recently, over the past couple of decades, Keith has turned to the topic of consciousness with a focus on developing a view known as illusionism, which, as many of us know, has gained increasing popularity in recent years and is, I think, a very exciting prospect for the science of consciousness. And I think you'll see that featured also in today's talk. So today, Keith is going to be telling us about AI and consciousness and how to think about artificial consciousness. So thanks so much for joining us in the Consciousness Club, Keith, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for that build-up. It's wonderful to see so many people here and so many friends. Hello to you all. So no pressure on me then to tell you. Well, I've set myself quite an ambitious title here: how to think about artificial consciousness. And I'll give you a spoiler. The answer is don't. But we'll get to that. This image here, just to introduce it, this is from the cover of a collection that Bill Ramsey and I edited 10 years ago for Cambridge University Press, the Oxford Handbook of Artificial Intelligence. Now, I still think it's a good book, but in many ways it's dated. Things have moved on very rapidly in the past 10 years in many areas in artificial intelligence. But there's one area where I think they haven't moved on too much, and that's in thinking about consciousness. In fact, I would say that in some ways they've gone a bit backwards. So I'm going to try to tell you how I think they should go. Let's begin with something with a position that I label phenomenal realism. I'll explain this. To start with, let's say some, I think, pretty innocuous things about consciousness, some things that we can all agree on, I think, pretty much. When you attend to something perceptually, as this person is attending to this apple, we say that we have a conscious experience of it. Okay. And when you have a conscious experience, your perceptual systems provide you with information about the thing you're attending to, about its color, its size, its distance, its texture, whatever, depending on their modality. That's pretty innocuous. And again, pretty innocuous, your brain generates a host of reactions to the stimulus, psychological reactions, physiological reactions, and it's behavioral ones. It's easy to underplay that and just say it like that, and yeah, you see something and you react to it. Yeah, you do. But unpacking all that, I think, is the key to everything. Another fairly uncontroversial thing is that when you have a conscious experience, you can tell introspectively that you're having it. At least humans can. If you ask yourself what sort of experience you're having, you can tell. You can describe your conscious experiences and compare them. They're often said to be ineffable, but there's certainly ways of describing them. You can compare them with each other. You can say what other experiences they resemble. You can say whether you like them or not. There's lots of ways you can describe them. Now, another, I take it, uncontroversial thing, your senses often provide you with information about the world without you having a conscious experience. We pick up a lot of stuff subliminally. This is perfectly obvious when you think about it, about navigating yourself down a busy street, say, either in a car or just on foot. You know, not constantly banging into things, but you're not consciously attending to them all. You're picking up this stuff at least in an inattentive way, if not in a completely non-conscious way. And then, of course, there are more extreme conditions such as blind sight and so on, which I'm sure you all know about. So we could say, as a rough and ready definition to get us kicked off, that consciousness is whatever it is that makes the difference between attentive perception and subliminal perception. Note that might not be a single thing, might not be a well-defined thing, might not be a natural kind, might be a cluster of things, might be different things in different cases. But anyway, it gets us a sort of grip on what it is we're talking about. And a further thing that is uncontroversial is that it's sometimes said, particularly under the influence of a notorious paper by Thomas Nagel, that it's like something to have a conscious experience. In fact, a lot of people take this particular locution as giving us a definition of consciousness. To be in a conscious state is to be in a state that's like something for you. That can seem quite a compelling way of putting it, though it's not clear that it translates well into other languages. Very interesting to unpack exactly why that phrase seems so compelling to us. Anyway, I take it all that's pretty much uncontroversial as far as anything is in this area. Now, I want to introduce a particular conception of consciousness, a particular way of thinking of this so far innocuous thing, the phenomenal way of thinking about it. Now, the idea here is that consciousness, the thing that makes the difference between subliminal and attentive perception, consists in an inner world, a private world of felt qualities that are somehow distinct from all the informational and reactive processes that I mentioned. You look at the apple, you get information about its color, size, distance, texture, yada, 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 yada. But you also have this this experience of an apple, this vividly present, reddish, shiny-ish, apple-ish feel in your mind. Here's a quotation from David Chalmers, of course, who played a huge role in setting up this way of thinking about consciousness. When we think and perceive, there's a whir of information processing, but there's also a subjective aspect. There is something it is like, again, picking up that phrase, to be a conscious organism. The subjective aspect is experience. Okay, so that's quite a bold claim. When we see, for example, we experience visual sensations, the felt quality of redness, the experience of dark and light, the quality of depth in a visual field. And this is meant to be something different, additional to, or at least an extra aspect of, the informational and reactive processes that are occurring. And it's subjective. In fact, as you can see from Tom Nagel's original paper, it's irreducibly subjective, meaning that it's only there for the subject. No third person access to it. So these qualities are the qualities of seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling textures, having pains. It's quite easy to elaborate on this and make it all seem very, very plausible, because I think we know what he's getting at. Now, it's important to stress that these qualities of the mind, of mental states or brain states, if you think the mind and brain are the same thing, not of the objects perceived. We attribute them to the objects perceived. We say that the apple has this reddish quality, but the reddishness is actually in our mind. All that's out there in the apple, that's why the apple is monochrome here, is a certain surface properties, a certain reflectance profile, which doesn't change from observer to observer or under lighting conditions and so on, whereas the quality does. And this is often said to be an intrinsic feature of the experience, which means that it can't be captured in terms of the functions of the mental states involved, of what they're doing, of what causes them, of what effects they have. It's the inner nature of that process, accessible only to the subject there. I mentioned this already, irreducibly subjective. Neuroscientists can detect or the functions of the various, what the different bits of your brain are doing, whether they're processing information, generating certain kinds of reactions, controlling various bodily or mental processes, but they can't detect this intrinsic nature, this feel. That's subjective. That's just for the person themselves. And because of that, we can't know what other people's qualities are like. Yours could be different from mine. Yours might be the ones you have when you look at a ripe apple of the kind we all call red, might be of the sort that I have when I'm looking at a blue sky and so on. You're familiar with this inverted spectrum stuff. These things are also supposed to be, they're not just available only to the subject, but they're available immediately to the subject with a certainty and infallibility that nothing else is. It's not just that I'm the only person who knows what my felt qualities are like. I know them perfectly, at least if I'm properly attending to them and choosing the right words and so on. I cannot make certain incidental errors, but their nature is revealed to me. As Philip Goff likes to put it, we know that their essential nature immediately. Names for these things: qualia, phenomenal properties, what it is likenesses, picking up on that phrase again. Yeah. Some people will want to distinguish different nuances between these words. I'm not going to bother for now. I'll call them phenomenal properties, and this kind of consciousness, phenomenal consciousness. Now, I think that view is implicit in a lot of thinking about consciousness, even among people who perhaps wouldn't immediately endorse everything I've just said. And the view assumes something like this, as Dennett pointed out. It assumes that there's something like an inner presentation of these qualities to some inner observer. There's a sort of theatre inside the mind where these things are displayed, where all the information from the different senses comes together, is turned into qualia, into phenomenal properties, and somehow observed or detected or presented to you. Phenomenal realism assumes, as Dennett says, a Cartesian theory. After Descartes, of course, who thought that the pineal gland kind of served this interface function between the brain and the immaterial mind. A place where it all comes together and consciousness happens. All the different sensory information has to be somehow integrated into this multisensory show of phenomenal properties, of qualia, and presented to you. We might say that the show is consciousness, or that it's presented to consciousness. People talk in these ways. Somehow that is the consciousness arena. And there are three elements to this. There's the show, the phenomenal properties. There's a subject who's aware of them. These are, after all, subjective properties. There has to be a subject who's encountering them. What that subject is, I don't know, arguably distinct from the organism. After all, the organism's just a physical thing like like anyone else. If someone else can't observe your phenomenal properties, how could you, considered as simply as a physical organism, observe them? And an epistemic relation between the two. This is the relation I talked of immediate awareness, often called acquaintance, direct acquaintance. It's the most basic epistemic relation. It's not mediated by anything, mediated by any mechanism, and its essence revealing. Pretty powerful stuff. And that relation is very unlike the relation between the organism and the organism itself, the whole organism, and the worldly properties that perceive. That's mediated by sensory systems and can go wrong in all sorts of ways. But for a start, it's highly selective and not essence revealing. And that's why we need science. And it can go wrong in all sorts of ways. Now, I think a lot of people who I would label phenomenal realists will deny that they're actually committed to something as as sort of extravagant and as that, but I'm not so sure. What else could these mental qualities be if not something like a show in a Cartesian theatre? I like to press them on that. There are ways of wriggling around it, but, you know, as Dennett puts it, the persuasive, I was going to say pervasive, which is that as well, the persuasive imagery of the Cartesian theatre keeps coming back to haunt us, lay people and scientists alike. I think a lot of people who would certainly not endorse the label Cartesian, not accept the label Cartesian, and think of themselves as thoroughgoing materialists, still have this imagery floating around the back of their minds. And Dennett certainly thought that. He referred to them as Cartesian materialists. There are ways of wriggling around this, but none of them, I think, really work in the end. Now, let's ask ourselves this question. Okay, so consciousness, this conception of consciousness as phenomenal consciousness, suppose that's how we think about consciousness. We think about it something along those lines. Maybe we want to quibble over the details, but that's roughly how we think about it. Could we create a phenomenally conscious robot? Well, there would be an awful lot of problems. How would you design it? To design a machine, you need really something like, a description of what you want the machine to do, some sort of specification. We want it to, make widgets or, detect certain kinds of physical properties or do a certain sorts of calculations or whatever. Provide that functional description. And then build mechanisms that perform the relevant functions. Of course, then you have to sort of rinse and repeat. You have to specify the functions you want. You need the mechanism that the mechanisms need to perform, and then build sub-mechanisms that perform those sub-functions and so on. Now we have a rough idea of how to do that with many mental capacities. Perception, it's about detecting certain features of the world and of one's own body. Memory, storing information, recalling it at relevant times, perhaps reconstructing it as well. Reasoning, deductive, inductive reasoning. We have ideas of how to do that, and we already produce machines that can do perform at least rudimentary versions of those tasks. It's more than rudimentary. The phenomenal consciousness is very different. Simply for that reason, they can't be characterized in terms of their function. That's the whole point of the way they were introduced. They were introduced by contrast with the functional stuff, their intrinsic properties, defined solely by their subjective aspect, by the way they intrinsically feel to the subject. So you've got to make something that feels a certain way to the thing that has it. How on earth do you do that? After all, as many phenomenal realists like to point out, we can imagine zombies, philosophical zombies, P-zombies, whose brains perform all the same functions that ours do without having any of these things. Maybe that never happens, they say, because the universe is conveniently set, or God or whatever is conveniently set up laws to make sure that it never does happen. But it's certainly conceivable. There's no a priori entailment from physical stuff, from function to feel. You can always imagine this intrinsically subjective bit missing, which isn't surprising given that it's essentially subjective. Because what you'll be imagining is some objective thing, some mechanism. And you can always imagine that mechanism lacking the subjective world that's supposed to constitute consciousness. Of course you can. You've set it up that way. So if we cannot characterize consciousness in functional terms, then we can't design a machine to produce it. I mean, that just falls straight out of the way that the phenomenal consciousness has been conceived. So to match the hard problem, did I mention the term hard problem? That's the problem, that's Chalmers' term for explaining how the brain produces phenomenal consciousness. To match that hard problem, we have the hard project of creating a machine that has peak consciousness. And they're both not just hard, but actually impossible. Okay, let's persist though. Someone might say, well, and I think people do say, if we can't design peak consciousness, can't we at least replicate it? We know that some things have it. You and I have it, right? So maybe we don't know how our brains produce it, but can't we at least replicate it? Get artificial things to do what our brains do, even if we can't quite understand how they do it. And the way forward here is to find the brain, supposedly, is to find the brain systems that produce consciousness in us, the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCC, and then replicate them artificially. This talk of correlates, I think, is very common in consciousness science, and I think very, very damaging. We're not talking about the things that the mechanisms of consciousness. We're talking about the mechanisms that go along with consciousness in some mysterious way, that somehow produce it, or whose intrinsic nature is consciousness. It's not like finding the mechanisms of memory. We don't talk about finding the correlates of memory. We find the mechanisms of memory, the systems that actually constitute memory. We don't look for the neural correlates of the gastric correlates of digestion. We look for the systems that do the digesting. Okay, anyway, that's the idea. We identify the neural correlates and replicate them artificially. Right, but now we've got another problem. How do I identify these things? Well, a lot of people have been trying. But the problem is, of course, how do you identify the neural correlates of something you can't detect? If we can't detect consciousness, how on earth can we detect what it's correlated with? You know, one side of the correlation is hidden from us. So the best we can do is to identify brain regions that produce reactions that are associated with consciousness, that we take to be associated with consciousness. Notice that we don't look for the neural correlates of the reactions. We look for the actual mechanisms of the reactions. We can find out how those reactions are produced. Anyway, the idea is that we identify the correlates of consciousness with the mechanisms that produce the reactions we associate with consciousness. E.g., we disrupt various brain regions and see if the subject still says they can see the stimulus, if it's a visual one, or they still perform some behavior that we've instructed them to perform when they're aware of the stimulus. Or we could take other non-intentional reactions such as eye movements or whatever. Any kind of act doesn't have to be an action. Anything we take to be reliably associated with consciousness. So we detect, what we're detecting is the neural correlates. I just said we shouldn't call them correlates. The neural correlates of the behavioral correlates of consciousness. But that, of course, assumes a correlation between behavior and consciousness. You've got to start with that. You can't test that. That has to be assumed to follow this approach. And you can never be sure that that assumption is correct. Maybe when you disrupt a certain brain region, the person no longer displays certain of the reactions that go along with consciousness, but they are still conscious of the stimulus. It's just that we've disrupted the mechanisms that allow for the reactions, that enable the reactions. Maybe the consciousness is still there, even though the person says, no, I can't see it. Maybe they're unable to report it. Maybe we've temporarily made them we've temporarily disconnected the qualia they're experiencing from the mechanism that allow them to report it. Indeed, even the subject themselves can't be sure. Maybe they haven't. Maybe we ask them, did you see the stimulus? And they say, no, but maybe they did see it. But the moment they'd seen it, they lost all memory of seeing it because of the disruption. Our disruption prevented them from remembering that they'd seen it, or reacting to it even internally in their own minds, in their own reasoning and memory. There's no way you can establish experimentally a correlation between something that's happening in the brain and something that you've no way of experimentally detecting. Of course, we can have all sorts of speculations about how reactions are correlated with consciousness. But as we saw earlier, as phenomenal realists conceive of consciousness, there's no entailment there. Any of those reactions could occur without consciousness. Indeed, it could be that everyone except yourself is a zombie. There's no way of experimentally determining. Okay, well, let's push it a bit further, though. Let's suppose we could identify the neural correlates somehow. We'd still have a problem. What level of detail would we have to replicate them to make sure that we replicated consciousness? Would the replica systems just have to perform the same functions? So that they're doing some sort of visual processing, say, in the case of visual consciousness, would they just have to do the same sort of information processing? Or would they have to perform those functions using the same mechanisms in the same way? There are many different ways of performing the same function, of getting to the moving from an input to getting from an input to a certain output. Many different ways of doing it. Would they have to use the same mechanisms for performing the functions? Would the replica systems have to perform the same functions by means of the same mechanisms and have those mechanisms made out of the same materials? Does it matter whether the materials that realize the mechanisms that perform the functions are biological? Some people think it is, etc., etc. I mean, some people think consciousness goes right down to the subatomic level, so who knows? Since we don't know how the neural correlates create consciousness, that's why we're calling them correlates. We don't know which aspects of them are the crucial ones. And there are many, many theories as to which it might be. But again, there's no way of testing these. You have to have these assumptions built in at the start. This is very nice for philosophers who can come along and do metaphysics on all this and tell you what they think the correlating principles are. Lovely, it keeps them in work. But I'm getting cynical. But it's an odd way for science to proceed. That you first have to go to the philosophers for a metaphysical theory. Sure, I'm not saying science doesn't need metaphysics. Don't get me wrong about that. I think it does. But that one specific mental function should be dependent on a very specific kind of theorizing. And that's odd. Specific kind of metaphysical theorizing is odd. The metaphysics that do for the rest of the mind, indeed for biology generally, should do for consciousness. Indeed, of course, some say that brains aren't necessary for consciousness at all. Panpsychism is in vogue these days. Maybe all sorts of things are conscious that we never suspected. Once you've conceptualized consciousness in this way, nothing's off limits. Finally, how do you tell if we succeeded? Showing my age here with a picture from the 1980s Star Trek. We can't detect phenomenal properties directly. There's no conceptual link between the properties we can detect and phenomenal properties, as there is between mechanisms that realize a certain function and the function. So suppose we create a robot that displays all the reactions we associate with consciousness, including all the psychological reactions. We can investigate what's happening in its brain, and we can work out what kind of psychological states are being supported by the processes there. The memories, beliefs, and so on, all functionally characterized, perceptions and so on. So it says it's conscious, it believes it's conscious, it even claims that its experiences have these mysterious phenomenal properties. We still couldn't be sure it really was conscious in the phenomenal sense, because we couldn't be sure that we'd replicated our consciousness in exactly the right way. There'd always be some difference between it and us, as indeed there are differences between individuals and between us and animals. And we can't be sure which of those are the crucial ones for consciousness, conceived in this phenomenal way. Maybe the creature is a zombie, which lacks the essential properties of consciousness. Only it knows, and even maybe it doesn't know. Maybe it is firmly convinced that it's conscious, phenomenally conscious, even though it isn't. Many clear-headed phenomenal realists accept this possibility. David Chalmers accepts that his zombie duplicate would be as convinced as he is that it's phenomenally conscious, and as puzzled as he is about phenomenal consciousness, and would say and write and insist and argue as persuasively for all the positions he does. This is going nowhere. Finally, what's the point? I'm pressing this because I think this may seem, I hope this seems obvious, but I don't think the message, people really take the message to heart. They might give, they might say, yes, that all sounds sensible, but their practice often betrays it. Let's suppose, after all, that we could create phenomenal properties and could be convinced that we'd succeeded. So what happens is something like this in our artificial system. Stimuli are transduced first into patterns of electronic activity. So there's some artificial retina transduces light waves into patterns of electronic activity in a network, say. And then it transduces them into phenomenal properties. They've got to somehow be these patterns of electronic activity have somehow got to generate phenomenal properties, or maybe the phenomenal properties that have intrinsic nature, but somehow out of this activities, phenomenal properties have to come. Well, what would happen then? Okay, there, bang, it's conscious. So what? What effects would the phenomenal properties have? Dennett calls this the hard question. He actually used that term before Chalmers coined the phrase the hard problem. What difference does it make that something becomes conscious, that something enters consciousness? And then what happens, Dan says, if you want a whole theory of consciousness, this is the question you must ask and answer after you have delivered some item to consciousness, whatever your arrival in consciousness amounts to. If instead you just stop there and declare victory, you say, okay, these are the conditions under which things become conscious. Great, information becomes conscious. You've burdened the subject or the self, whatever it is that's acquainted with these properties, these qualities, with the task of reacting or doing something with the delivery. And you've left that task unanalyzed. If something isn't observing these phenomenal properties and reacting to them, well, it's like a television playing in an empty room. No point in it. And the only way this could happen, the only way these phenomenal properties could have any effects on the brain and on the systems the brain controls, including the body, is that there'd have to be a transduction back into electronic activity. In the case of an artificial mind, back into neural activity in the case of a brain. So why not just cut out the middleman? Everything would be exactly the same in terms of effects if the show weren't there. It's like you want to record a video signal onto a DVD or something. You don't plug the signal into a monitor and get a camera and film the monitor and record the output from the camera. You just plug the two cables together. There's no difference. So here's the moral. If I were going there, I wanted to create artificial consciousness, I wouldn't start from here with this phenomenal conception. Consciousness consists in phenomenal properties, then the project of building it artificially is a non-starter. We couldn't design it, we couldn't tell which brain systems to replicate. We couldn't tell at what level of detail to replicate them. We couldn't tell if we'd succeeded, and there'd been no point in doing it. Let's see if this works. Okay, I'm not sure what, can't remember what the moves from. It's a man saying that he wouldn't start from here if he were going somewhere, giving directions. That to me is the moral for phenomenal realists. And perhaps this isn't a surprising conclusion. Perhaps the notion of phenomenal consciousness reflects intuitions about human specialness. We have some essence that resists physical explanation and artificial replication. Perhaps there's something like that in it. But if we think that we are ourselves physical systems, conscious biological robots, then we shouldn't think of consciousness this way. So how should we think of it? Okay. Now, there's a lot I could say here, and I'm going to run through this fairly quickly to give you the alternative perspective, or an alternative perspective. And then I'm going to come to some morals about how we should think of artificial consciousness. Okay, I'll go fairly quickly here. The rival claim, if you do away with Qualia, with phenomenal properties, then instead the other option is to think of consciousness as a complex functional state, essentially a cluster of effects. So sensory information on this view is conscious when it has a big effect in the neural society, as Dennett liked to say, when it becomes famous in the brain. So when it's available to a wide range of brain systems, probably targeted by attention and therefore maybe perhaps globally broadcast, and generates a wide range of reactions and reactive dispositions, when it produces lots of probably low-level changes to brain systems, when it retunes attention, expectation, belief, modulates emotion, has effects on memory, triggers associations, starts off trains of reasoning, yada, yada, yada. It affects a reorientation of the whole system. Most of this, and also triggers physiological changes, maybe changes in heartbeat, through chemical signaling such as hormones and so on, which are themselves monitored and contribute to the overall effect of the stimulus. Your heart starts racing, your stomach gives a jump, whatever. This is all contributes to it. So when a stimulus, lots of stimuli, of course, are just subliminally perceived ones, just have a few minor effects and die away. But some stimuli get boosted into creating great waves of effects. As I said, creating beliefs, evoking memories, triggering associations, initiating emotional responses, priming all sorts of behavioral responses, reorienting sensory, reorientating attention, changing sensory expectations. You could tell all this nicely within a predictive processing story, probably. And the idea is that consciousness isn't produced by all that, as if it was something extra. It is all that. It just is that complex of informational and reactive processes. That's it. It doesn't generate consciousness. Consciousness isn't the intrinsic nature of that. That doesn't make the lights come on. That is consciousness. That's what we're talking about when we talk about consciousness, even if we don't quite conceptualize it in that way. Informational influence or neural fame. Here's Dan again. Being an item in consciousness is not at all like being on television. It's rather a species of mental fame, almost literally. Consciousness is cerebral celebrity, nothing more, nothing less. Those contents are conscious that persevere, that monopolize resources long enough to achieve certain typical and symptomatic effects, the reactions we take to be indicative of consciousness. Memory, control of behavior, and so forth. Okay, but what about these phenomenal properties? What do we say about it? We say that, okay, there's all this reactivity going on, that's being conscious, but why? But still, what are why we have the sense that there are these things here that are confronting us, what its likeness, what is that gesturing at? What do we say about the phenomenal properties? Well, we say they're not real, or at least not instantiated, but we've got to say a bit more about that. This is where the illusionism bit comes in. conscious experiences seem to have phenomenal properties, in a certain sense of seem, not in a phenomenal sense, obviously. There aren't further phenomenal properties that constitute the illusion. They're illusory. The idea is that we have introspective capacities that can monitor these waves of reaction, which would be a very useful thing for social creatures to do, so they can tell each other about what effects stimuli have on them. And but it misrepresents them. It doesn't represent all the detail, all the complex detail of these huge reactive patterns. It just represents them as simple, global. Global is anyway. It's simple, unstructured things that are happening to us. Compare colours. This is a nice analogy from Dirk Perboom. Colour concepts, like colour concepts, track reflectance profiles of object surfaces, which are very complex things indeed. But our visual systems misrepresent these properties as simple colours. Okay, we don't conceptualize the color. We think of things as having colours, but we don't conceptualize their colours as reflectance profiles. It takes a lot of scientific work to realize that what these concepts track are actually reflectance profiles. Similarly, the idea is that phenomenal concepts, the concepts of the mental colours, track complex functional properties of the brain, these reactivity patterns, as I call them. But again, misrepresent them as simple phenomenal ones. Mental colours. Now we pretty much all agree that external colour qualities are illusory. The world isn't sort of painted with colours in the way that we naively take it to be. It looks different to different people and to different animals and so on. What's stable are the reflectance profiles. So external colour qualities are illusory, and so are the internal ones. Very quickly, to head off an objection that often comes to mind here, it's tempting to think that to have an illusion is to have a show of the illusory thing in the Cartesian theatre. So when you're hallucinating something, the thing isn't there, but there's an appearance of it in the Cartesian theatre. Now, of course, if you think of illusions in that way, then if I say we're hallucinating a phenomenal show in the Cartesian theatre, then there'd have to be an appearance of a Cartesian theatre in a showing in a second Cartesian theatre. Not how to think of it. Illusionists aren't just proposing that phenomenal properties are illusions. They're proposing a rethinking of the nature of illusion itself, of consciousness itself. So here's how to think of it. Experiencing the external world doesn't involve a phenomenal appearance of it being shown in the theatre. It involves being related to the external world through a web of informational sensitivities, reactive dispositions. And perceptual illusions occur when this information is reactive, when you're engaged with the world when your engagement with the world is somehow misaligned. You're reacting in a way that's inappropriate to what's actually there. Similarly, experiencing an internal world doesn't involve a phenomenal appearance of an internal world being shown in another Cartesian theatre. It involves being related to your own internal world, neural world, through a web of informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions. It's basically perceiving your own perceiving, reacting to your own reacting. And again, introspective illusions occur when the information in this second web is inaccurate, when you're locked onto your own internal activity in a way that's misaligned to the reality, maybe adaptively misaligned. You don't need to know all the details. You don't need to get it all right. All you need is a sense of how things are going, with a general sense of the shape of how things are unfolding with you. But it's misaligned when you take it as a basis for doing serious thinking about the nature of consciousness. It's useful enough for everyday purposes, just as colour talk is useful enough for everyday purposes, but not a good basis for colour science. It needs reinterpreting in the light of optics and physics and so on. So the general idea is this, that introspection delivers partial distorted information about our brain processes, causing us to react as if they had phenomenal properties. The phenomenal properties are merely intensional objects, things that exist only as objects of our beliefs and introspective representations, like fictional characters. And what it is that introspection is tracking is these first order patterns, reactivity patterns that are produced by sensory stimuli. So we have basic consciousness, rich information and reactive engagement with one's environment, sensory consciousness, we might call it, and then introspective consciousness, which is a rich information and reactive engagement with one's own basic consciousness, with one's own sensory consciousness. So we can tell how sensory consciousness is evolving. Noticing, you're noticing. Reacting to, you're reacting. Creating the illusion of a Cartesian theatre. And the properties we attribute to our experiences correspond to the patterns of reaction being generated. They're a way of talking about that reactivity. So they're schematic representations of the impact, the significance of what we're perceiving. It's very easy to, I think, to see why it would be useful to have that. At least if you're social creatures, language-using creatures, you can share information about how things affect you, about what impact they have on you, what significance they have. You can taste the bitter fruit and say, don't try that, it's awful. You don't have to wait for the world to impact on you to anticipate its, to know about it, what its impact will be. You can anticipate. What have we got here? Oh, well, it's important to understand here that the illusion of phenomenal properties isn't meant to be a substitute for phenomenal consciousness. It's not that you need introspective consciousness in order to have conscious experience. It's not that this illusion somehow makes the lights come on and does what the notion of phenomenal consciousness was supposed to do, namely transforming us from zombies into genuinely conscious creatures. That isn't the idea at all. You don't need this introspective consciousness to be conscious. Basic consciousness, sensory consciousness is independent of introspection. And creatures without introspection would still be conscious in that basic way, in that sensory way. What you need the introspection for is the illusion of phenomenal consciousness. But that in itself is not the heart of consciousness, if you like. Basic consciousness is sensory consciousness. Okay, I'll skip this slide because it's just about how we, as it were, project these qualities onto the world. And now I'll get to the yeah, I've got about 5 or 10 minutes to give you the moral. Right, implications for creating artificial consciousness. We saw that the implications for phenomenal realists are wholly negative. You know, just you can't do it. Just it's not that it's. I mean, you might accidentally do it, but you wouldn't even know you'd succeeded. So it's not a feasible project at all. It's just don't waste your time on it. If you take the phenomenal realist view. Now, on the sort of view I've been sketching, the functional view, illusionist view, it's certainly feasible. All of these informational reactive processes that constitute both basic consciousness and introspective consciousness, they can all be analyzed in functional terms. All a matter of detecting certain things and producing certain reactions to them. So you could design a machine that had them. So it'd be feasible, it'd be an extremely difficult project, but feasible. We just need to unpack all the information and reactive complexity that our brains support and replicate it. So in Chalmers' misleading terms, it's what Chalmers would call an easy project, meaning one that can be replicating something that can be explaining something that can be conceptualized in functional terms. So, as I said, it would involve designing artificial brains with the right set of complex sensitivities and reactive dispositions, and perhaps including introspective ones, but not necessarily. Depends what you want it to do. However, It's not a distinct project. Creating artificial consciousness is not a distinct project on this view. What do I mean by that? I mean, which of our sensitivities and reactive dispositions should we seek to replicate in order to create consciousness? I mean, we have a lot of them, right? Bad question. Consciousness isn't something that's created by the right cluster of functional processes. Not to say, look, okay, which of these particular processes, that information and reactive processes are crucial to creating consciousness? Oh, all of them, none of them. I mean, consciousness isn't something other than a certain cluster of information reactive processes, the functional processes. It's not a matter of getting the right set that produce it. All there is a cluster of reactive and functional processes, and they'll be different. And so it's not something like that you have the right functions, then bang, the qualia kick in. That's not it at all. It just is a cluster of functional processes that are different in different creatures, and doubtless in subtle ways different from individual to individual. The consciousness of a dog is going to be different from mine. Your consciousness is subtly different from mine because we have different sets of reactive dispositions. The consciousness of people with sensory impairments, with color blindness or whatever, different from those of people with typical color vision. They're not more or less conscious. One of them is really conscious. They've got the right set of things. It's different, graded on all sorts of dimensions. So creating consciousness per se, as if it was a well-defined thing, that can't be a goal. The question we need to ask is, what kind of consciousness do we want to create? Humankind? Dog kind? I mean, there's going to be no boundary here. There's no qualitative distinction between creatures that are conscious and creatures that aren't. There's not some point at which the qualia kick in, the light comes on, yada yada. No. I mean, it shades off until you get until the we take us as a baseline, we could shade off into different, perhaps more minimal forms of sensitivity and reactivity, right down to cases where we probably wouldn't want to talk about consciousness, though there's no bright line that has been crossed. And then on the other side, we could imagine the richer and richer forms of reactivity, of sensitivity and reactivity over there. And yeah, there's no well-defined target. Indeed, I suspect that these, when we approach the subject in this way, consciousness will fractionate in all sorts of ways, just as other psychological functions have done, like memory. And we may need some multi-dimensional way of mapping different forms of the thing we talk about as consciousness. And we may find that even the word consciousness is just not doing anything at all for us. After all, evolution didn't select for consciousness as such. It selected for specific sensory capacities and reactive dispositions, including in us capacities for self-monitoring, which may have been hugely boosted by cultural processes, by language and cultural processes. Consciousness couldn't have been a pressure for consciousness as such. There's pressure for specific capacities, and we call the result consciousness. Okay, so you can't really just sit down and say, I want to create artificial consciousness. Well, what sort of consciousness do you want to create, and why? So here's how to think about artificial consciousness. Don't think about making your machine conscious. Think about what you want it to do and how you can get it to do it. What its goals will be, what things it should be sensitive to, what information it needs, how it should react to them, what it should do with that information, what sensory, learning, evaluative, reasoning capacities it needs, what forms of memory it needs, and so on and so on. What degree of autonomy it needs, what level of self-control it needs, whether it needs to have introspective capacities, so it can reflect on its own goals and its own on its own mental states and so on, and whether it Now that might be risky, because then it might decide that it doesn't like the goals you've given it and wants to do something else. Maybe it finds that certain states, experiences, let's call them, it kind of likes more than we'd expected it to, and that it goes off and pursues those instead of doing the things we wanted it to, as I guess from the genes point of view, we humans have done, practicing birth control, things like that, etc. So you look after the functions and let consciousness look after itself. That's the moral. Quickly, 2 objections, and then I'll stop. But how will we tell if our machine is conscious? The same objection before. Made to the phenomenal realist. Bad question again. You'll never make it phenomenally conscious, because phenomenal consciousness is illusory. And you'll inevitably make it functionally conscious to some degree if you equip it with complex informational sensitivities and reactive dispositions. It's kind of easy to make some level of functional consciousness in the way that I've characterized it. The good question is, how conscious is it? How similar are its sensitivities and reactive dispositions to ours? And if you're not sure about that, go and look and find out and do the work. I mean, look at the schematics, or if it's self-trained, analyze what it's trained itself to do. So you can answer those questions by studying the thing. Same for animals, by the way. Another objection: how can we tell if our machine has intrinsic ethical value? Well, you know, whether it really matters whether we should give it rights and so on. And indeed, some people ask this question: how can anything have intrinsic ethical value if it lacks phenomenal consciousness? Doesn't this illusionist perspective simply remove the ground of ethical value from the world? No, of course it doesn't. These are bad questions again. What it's like to be a creature. We might want to link ethical value to this thing we're gesturing at when we talk about what it's like to be the creature, whether it's, you know, whether it's in a positively valent state or a negatively valent state, we might say. But that isn't determined by a private phenomenal essence. It's a matter of how things affect it. That's what we're monitoring when we report what it's like, what experience is like for us. And that's a matter of what the thing's sensitive to and how it reacts, both internally and externally, to the things it's sensitive to. So if you're concerned for the welfare of a creature, and this goes for animals too, non-human animals, study how things affect it. Study what sort of reactions it has to things that happen to it. And if you want to know more about that, I've developed this answer in this paper here, which is open access. I think the implications of this perspective are benign. They make the facts that are relevant to ethical judgments, they take them out of this subjective realm and make them accessible to us all. If you want to know what it's like to be a bat, you can find out if you're prepared to pay enough attention to bats. If you want to know how much you should care about bats, study them. Don't sit in an armchair and do metaphysics. Okay. So thank you there. And at the end, if you want to look at the slides, there are a few references there. So I've talked to an hour. Thank you.
Thank